Але може дай сигнал, коли включити це відео перед тим, як ти почнеш.
I can't hear the sound.
Zoom meeting, the meeting of the Institute. Meeting information now in the meeting posted by Ecumenical Studies with 66 participants. Your audio is unmuted. Your video is off the Institute. Meeting information. On sound and voice.
Я всіх вас вітаю.
I'm glad to welcome everyone. Hello, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon to everyone. Glory to Jesus Christ. Thank you for your participation today. And also I'm grateful to those who were with us yesterday. Yesterday, we spent some time to make an introduction and to explain what aims are we trying to achieve by developing this project. We said that the main idea of the project is creating the conception of defamiliarization or estrangement. So we're trying to assess our conflict from a distance. We're trying to walk back, to step back, and to see what's going on a bigger scale. Today's introductory lecture by Professor Powers aims at showing various aspects of the issue of religious approaches to peace building. What potential do religious communities have when facing conflicts? How, in various contexts, different tools can be used by the church, by the government, or by the civil society? That's why today we are going to receive a panoramic picture of religious approaches to conflicts and to the questions of peace building, while in our next webinars we will be able to give a closer look to particular cases: the Balkans, Northern Ireland, Middle East, Israeli and Palestine conflict. If I can ask you kindly switch off your mics because it distorts the sound, and the question of Polish-German reconciliation. Professor Gerard Powers is a person who for decades has been dealing with issues of peace building. Professor Powers is professor of the Krok Institute of the Institute of Peace at the University of Notre Dame in the United States of America. He's also the director of the Catholic Center of Researchers for Peace Building, and he is coordinator of Catholic Peace Building Network. This network encompasses a lot of different regional hubs of peace building in various countries. On top of this, Professor Powers is aware of a wide range of issues connected with church facilitating peace. Since 1998 till 2003, he was leading the organization of the conference of U.S. Conference of Bishops, of Catholic Bishops. Before that, he was counselor in the foreign policy, so to say, of this structure. The main interests of Professor Powers are ethics, the ethics of application force, religion in conflict and peace building, and also ethics in foreign policy of the United States. The last project by Professor Powers are focused on the questions of combating nuclear power. He is the author and the editor of numerous books dedicated to the topic of peace building. That's why it's my pleasure to have Professor Powers with us today, and I'm grateful that he agreed to deliver our today's introductory lecture. And the last thing, it's the translation. I hope you understand that in order to hear the lecture in Ukrainian, you have to press the button interpretation at the bottom of your panel and select Ukrainian. And then you will be able to hear the Ukrainian translation of Professor Powers' lecture.
Or the Middle East or some other areas. Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to religious peace building. But in my 20 minutes, let me highlight a few of the general issues that arise in many cases of religious peace building. And these are just a few of many issues that we can address. First, an examination of conscience, or in other words, what is the role of religion in the conflict? In virtually every conflict, religion is both a part of the problem and a part of the solution. A collage of images of the Catholic Church during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, might include the two Franciscan priests who were advisors to Mate Boban, the Croat neo-fascist who led the ethnic cleansing of Serbs and Muslims and was later convicted for that. That collage would also have to include Bishop Franjo Kamarica, who is called the Archbishop Romero of Bosnia by Human Rights Watch, because he urged Croats in Banja Luka to follow a strategy of nonviolence in the face of some of the worst ethnic cleansing of that war. This is what my colleague at Notre Dame, Scott Appleby, calls the ambivalence of the sacred. The challenge for religious peace builders is to find ways to marginalize the religious extremist, as the church authorities tried to do with Mate Boban's Franciscan advisors, while showing how an unwavering commitment to one's faith, as shown by Bishop Kamarica, can be a powerful force for freedom, justice, and liberation. In other words, religious conflict does not derive from religion in general, but from particular religious aspects and actors. And so too, the peace-building power of religion does not come from religion in general, but from particular religious aspects and actors. And that's what religious peace builders have to be clear about. What are those particulars that contribute to conflict or contribute to peace building? The first task then is to do an examination of conscience, to carefully assess religious dynamics of a conflict and how those dynamics might either contribute to that conflict or contribute to peace building. Now, there are lots of ways to talk about the role that religion, how religion relates to conflict, but I'm going to use the categories that Isaac Svensson of Uppsala University used in a paper in a book, followed by a book that he did several years ago. The first two types of conflict reflect what could be called sins of commission. Svensson doesn't use, this is my addition to Svensson's categories. Sins of commission. First are religious conflicts where there's religious incompatibility or holy wars. In these cases, religious differences contribute to the conflict, and religion itself is used to justify violence. ISIL or Al-Qaeda is a classic example of that. Second, are conflicts that are called identity conflicts, where religious dissimilarity is the issue. In these identity conflicts, there's an inextricable link between the religious, ethnic, national identities of the parties of the conflict, and that, of course, contributes to division and conflict. Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Myanmar today are examples of that. A third type of conflict raises issues of what could be called sins of omission. And these conflicts, and these are the majority of conflicts, Svensson found that 58% of the world's conflicts were these conflicts, where religion plays no role in fomenting the conflict. Now, in some of these cases, like Colombia, Northern Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, religious actors have been a major force for peace. No sin of omission there. But in too many others, religious actors commit sins of omission because they fail to contribute to peace building in these secular conflicts. And that could be due to a number of reasons, including a failure of moral imagination or a mission failure. They fail to understand that the church's mission includes peace building in those particular conflicts. My guess is that a close examination of the role of religion in the conflict in Ukraine would find elements of each of these three types of conflicts: holy war, identity conflict, and secular conflict, where there's no religious dimension. Then the question is, are the religious entities in Ukraine guilty of sins of commission in contributing to those holy war elements or the identity conflict, or sins of omission in terms of not acting, using their capacity as religious actors to help build peace? The second point, after assessing the role of religion in a conflict, one must carefully assess the peace-building potential of our respective faith communities. I define peace-building broadly to include not just post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation, That's the definition that the United Nations and other entities use. But also what can be done to prevent conflicts from breaking out into violence in the first place, and to managing or mediating ongoing conflicts. So this is a very broad definition of peace building. It involves working with a wide range of political, military, economic, and civil society actors on a wide range of issues and at multiple levels: the local level, the national, the regional, and the international. Now, according to former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, faith-based organizations have more resources, more skilled personnel, a longer attention span, more experience, more dedication, and more success in fostering reconciliation than any government. Another way of putting it or thinking about that is to say that religion can play an indispensable role in peace building and reconciliation when its three main assets are put to work in an integrated way at all levels and across borders. These three assets are spiritualities, religious rituals, beliefs, and teachings; two, diverse institutional resources; and three, the ability to influence and mobilize people, or people power. Ukraine knows something about people power. You've demonstrated that a number of times in the last decade or so. John Paul Lederach, a Mennonite peace builder who has had a major impact on the field of peace building generally, not just religious peace building, but has trained many religious peace builders, says that the ubiquitous presence of religious bodies in many countries gives them a unique, if not unprecedented, presence in the landscape of conflict. Religious actors often have relationships with every level and nearly every aspect of conflict, which creates a depth and a breadth of access that few secular institutions enjoy, and that neatly aligns with the multi-level and multifaceted demands of peace building. That's John Paul Lederach. There are many, and these are mostly unheralded and unexamined, examples of what Albright and Lederach are talking about. You have direct or indirect involvement in mediating or facilitating peace processes in South Sudan, Colombia, Mozambique, Northern Uganda, and Northern Ireland. You have prominent roles in official truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, Ethiopia, Burundi, Guatemala, Chile, and Peru. You have efforts by Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, Jewish World Services, and other faith-based development agencies to integrate conflict sensitivity into their relief and development programs. You, of course, as this webinar is an example, you have peace education programs in religious schools and universities around the world. You have trauma healing programs in Rwanda and Burundi. You have zones of peace or local ceasefires negotiated by faith-based leaders with armed actors in Colombia and the Philippines. And you've got grassroots and national civil society efforts to support official peace processes in Colombia and South Sudan, sometimes called Track 3 peace building. And you have peace building training for military officers in Mindanao, in the Philippines, and in South Sudan. Before the referendum on independence in 2011, you had 100 days of praying for peace. It was sponsored by all the main churches in South Sudan. And you have monitoring human rights abuses in places like Chile and El Salvador. Those are just some of the diverse ways in which religious actors contribute to peace in really important ways that have an important impact. But what makes these efforts important and impactful? It is that they take an integrative or inclusive approach. They integrate the beliefs, institutions, and people power, the three main elements, assets that religious institutions bring to peace building. They integrate across different levels. Effective peace building requires bottom up, to be sure. It also requires top down, and it also requires everything in between. We can't privilege the bottom up, the top down, or the middle out. We have to do all. to be effective. And there are wonderful examples of that religious peace building at all levels. But in almost every case that I'm aware of, the main problem is that there isn't integration across those different levels. What's happening at the grassroots takes place with almost no connection to what's happening at the national level. And that makes both less impactful. Third is, the people power of religion is only possible if religious peace building is inclusive. It's got to be not just clergy, but also laity, men and women, leaders and ordinary people, young and old. Because so much focus is on male leaders in some of our denominations, the churches need to make a special effort to recognize and support the peace building roles of women and youth in particular. Third point, navigating the political peace building versus cultural peace building. One reason that you have sins of omission, the churches fail to be peace builders when they have the capacity to contribute to peace building. One reason is that peace building is inherently political. No doubt, there are many legitimate models of church, state, or religious political engagement. There's not just one model. The US model that's the model that I'm most familiar with, is not the best or only model. I'm not suggesting that. But religious actors must beware of political actors who instrumentalize and politicize religion for their own purposes. And when you engage in political dimensions of peace building, it's very easy for religion to become politicized and in the long run lose its credibility. Sometimes governments attempt to coordinate or promote religious peace building. But in my view, that is rarely needed. The religious groups know quite well how to coordinate with themselves and how to do peace in their own way. And when the government attempts to coordinate or promote religious peace building, it can undermine the credibility of religious actors because they are seen by some as pawns of political actors not operating independently. In some cases, however, it is appropriate for religious actors to assume a political role, such as when the Catholic bishops in the Democratic Republic of Congo recruited 70,000 volunteers. It's a massive effort to do election monitoring during the last presidential elections there. That effort was so effective that the bishops' conclusions about the fairness of the elections, and they raised doubts about the fairness of the elections, were considered more credible even than those of the official international election monitors. In that case, religious leaders assumed a substitute political role out of necessity. The normal political mechanisms could not be trusted in their view, and the bishops were the last credible actors left standing. I could say more about the political dimensions of peace building, but let me move to the cultural dimensions, because that's where I think religion can have its most long-term and transformative effect. And that is, how do you move from a culture of violence to a culture of peace? Amitei Etzioni argues that religion is a major source of a moral culture that is necessary for healing and hope in countries trying to escape violence and instability. In conflicts like Ukraine, where religious, ethnic, national identity contributes to conflict, the cultural challenge for religious peace builders is not religious violence, as important as that is, but religious nationalism. It is a positive good that religion and religious actors are deeply enculturated, that they deeply identify with national and cultural identity, and are often seen as defenders of their community's rights and aspirations. But religious actors must avoid becoming chaplains only to their own community. They must avoid becoming chaplains only to their own community. They must avoid taking refuge in a comfortable, ethical, and pastoral parochialism. It is very difficult to do that amidst the pressures of war. But one of the most important acts of peace building can be to condemn violence and human rights abuses committed by one's own religious, ethnic, or national group. In Northern Ireland, the Catholic bishops were severely criticized, particularly by Catholics, for condemning IRA violence, even though the IRA was not claiming to be a Catholic organization, it was a neo-Marxist organization. But the church was severely criticized by Catholics for condemning IRA violence and not being sufficiently prophetic in support of a beleaguered Catholic community. But I would argue that those condemnations of IRA violence was one of the most important things that the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland did, and it played a crucial role in limiting the conflict. In identity conflicts, the challenge for religious actors is to find religious resources that can delegitimize the chauvinist and exclusivist forms of nationalism, which fuel aggression and violence. Religious actors should celebrate and defend religious, cultural, and national identity, but they must do so in ways that promote inclusivist forms of civic nationalism and legitimate expressions of the virtue of patriotism. Promoting unity while celebrating diversity should be the calling card of religious peace builders. My fourth point, and here we're talking about ecumenical and interreligious peace building. I'll just use the term interreligious peace building to include ecumenical. Interreligious peace building often suffers from a paradox. The more religion is central to a conflict, the greater the need for interreligious peace building. The less religion is central to the conflict, the greater the likelihood that interreligious peace building will bear fruit. To be effective, interreligious peace building has to be clear about its purpose and its theory of change. Raina Neufeld talks about 4 general theories of change, and those of you who are involved in an ecumenical interfaith dialogue would be familiar with these categories. The first 2 are affective theories. The first affective theory is a dialogue of words. A dialogue of words is about better understanding the perspective of the other side and possibly changing hearts and minds of all those involved in that conversation aimed at better understanding. The second effective theory is dialogue of life. A dialogue of life focuses on building and deepening relationships across communal divisions, but providing safe spaces to come together, and oftentimes not coming together to dialogue about differences or commonalities, but coming together to work together for the common good, like to do a humanitarian relief project that serves both communities, for example. The second 2 theories of change behind interreligious dialogue are more social and structural, and they have more ambitious goals. The dialogue of faith seeks cultural change. It seeks to overcome the sectarianism and build a culture of peace. That's what I just referred to in my previous point. Joint statements against religious violence and calls for reconciliation, joint statements against extreme forms of religious nationalism would be an example of a dialogue of faith aimed at some sort of cultural change. Fourth is a dialogue of action. And this seeks structural or policy change. This is the Northern Uganda example is a good one, where you had the leaders of the 4 main religious groups work together to first convince Joseph Kony, one of the world's most despicable leaders, to engage in the peace process. And then once the peace process began, those 4 leaders facilitated that peace process. That's an example of dialogue of action. A couple of points about interreligious peace building. First, interreligious collaboration for peace often rightly focuses on finding common ground and moving to common witness and action. But in some cases, the most important fruit of dialogue is not what is done together, but what the coming together allows one to do within one's own community. In Mindanao, for example, interreligious dialogue has helped Catholic and Muslim leaders better understand the need to do much more work within their own communities to help them break out of their respective myths of unique victimization to counter stereotypes and prejudices, and to promote better understanding and respect for the legitimate hopes and fears of the other community. Second, as effective and important as interreligious peace building is, and interreligious peace building is very important, we must be careful not to put too many of our eggs in the interreligious basket. Oftentimes, the most urgent need is to mobilize one's own community for peace. This is in part because interreligious peace building is prone to a least common denominator approach. So it's prone to a least common denominator approach. So it lacks some of the power of single identity peace building, which can draw on the full complement and what is distinctive in each tradition's rituals, beliefs, norms, spiritualities, and communal identity. Moreover, while joint interreligious action can offer a powerful united front against religious extremists on both sides of a conflict, oftentimes the best way to marginalize extremists is for authentic and credible voices from within a particular denomination or religious tradition to convince their co-religionists that extremism is antithetical to that tradition. In short, interreligious peace building is essential and effective, but is not always the most needed and effective form of religious peace building, depending upon the particular context. In conclusion, religion is an often untapped resource for peace building. In many situations of conflict, religious actors can do much more to utilize their considerable assets to promote peace. In order to do that, they need to do something like a religious impacts assessment. Just as we do environmental impact assessments, we should do religious impact assessments. In conflict situations, religious actors need to rediscover their peace building mission and be very clear and concrete about the variety of ways their religious communities might contribute to conflict and the many ways that they can contribute to peace building. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, професор Пауерс, за
Thank you very much, Professor Powers, for your lecture, for indicating to us the ambivalence of the religious role or role of the religion in conflicts, in their appearance, attitude to conflicts. And also, thank you for making your accent that despite this ambivalence, churches and religion has tools that can foster reconciliation. We have now enough time for questions and for the discussion. And that's why I will kindly ask our participants to raise their hands by pressing a special button on the menu reactions. You can raise your hand and then I will pass the floor to you. Or alternatively, you can write your questions in the chat. But frankly, I can better see your raised hand rather than your question in the chat. You can also ask questions or make comments. If you like just to share your reaction that is not in the form of question, you are also welcome. I can see a question in the chat from Alexander Zhabenko. Would you like to articulate it, Alexander? Okay, then I will read it out loud. Are there some criteria for distinguishing between the types of the religion impact, the conflict, the types of the impact of religion onto the conflict? I think this question needs some clarification. I mean, Professor Gerard said that religion can have different impacts. In some cases, it can contribute to the conflict, like in case of holy wars, or when religion is tightly connected with nationality. But religion can also play a role of peace-building facilitator. And sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish in what way religion has impact. Maybe it's difficult to define in what way religion thinks about peace. So maybe sometimes religion has this impact on peace building, a positive, fostering impact, but it's difficult to see it. It's unclear. Also, religion can have different impact on different groups. Some people may perceive religion as peace building, peacemaker, and others may consider religion as a facilitator of conflicts. So what are the criteria, the strict criteria that make it possible for us to distinguish between these two possible impacts? Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, now it became much clearer, and we all understand the significance of this question. Gerard?
I'm really embarrassed, but I can't find the translation button on my screen.
Okay, so you go and select interpretation.
I can try to translate into English, but maybe not so fluently. I mean that there are different types of impact of religion into the on the conflicts. For example, you mentioned religious wars, for example, or religion and nationality conflicts, where the impact is attributive, is additive. So it can be also maybe diminishing or maybe peace building, because on the other hand, yes. And so what criteria are to distinguish these types of impact? For example, sometimes they are not so evident. They can be sometimes maybe not so evident, and we can hardly distinguish between them. So there should be such a criteria. Maybe can you tell about them more in detail?
I think that, there are many, one of the problems with some of the academic work on religion and peacebuilding is it's too general. It treats religion too much as a monolith, and it tries to categorize conflicts as religious conflicts or not religious conflicts in ways that I think are artificial. And so I think there's no substitute for a very thick understanding of the religious dynamics in a particular situation, both the dynamics that contribute to conflict and dynamics that contribute to peace building. I don't think that the categories, the three categories that I offered, holy war, identity conflicts, and no role for religion in promoting the conflict, those are very, very rough, very, very general and rough categories. In fact, as I mentioned, most conflicts would involve all of those dimensions and different versions of each. For example, the role that, say, religion plays in promoting violence, that brings in big, long-standing conversations about the difference between principled nonviolence, a just war approach to the use of force, and holy war. And I think, so in order to evaluate whether or not a religious actor or actors are contributing to, are allowing religion to be used to directly justify violence, it really requires a careful analysis of those three categories. To what extent is the religion promoting a principled nonviolence or a pragmatic nonviolence? To what extent is it promoting a permissive approach to the just war tradition, or versus a very restrictive approach to the just war tradition? And to what extent is it really promoting violence in the name of religion, the way some extremist groups do? And so I think for I think there's no substitute for a very thick, deep understanding of a particular conflict, which begins with a deep understanding of the religious actors in those conflicts and the various ways that they can contribute to conflict or contribute to peace building. And none of them are, all actors are, it's a mixed bag. It's some things they do contribute to conflict either indirectly or directly. Other things they do can contribute to peace building indirectly or directly. Nobody is purely a peace builder, purely, fomenting conflict.
Дуже дякую. Jared, чи вас...
Thank you very much. Gerard, can you hear now the translation into English?
Is your translation into English working?
I found the button yesterday, I'm sorry, but yes. I can't find it today.
It's down on the menu and it's called interpretation.
Yeah, I can't
You see
find
where
it.
you
I'm
have
very
like
sorry.
Participants mute, stop video, participants chat, record, break out rooms. One of them is interpretation.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. It's not showing up on my screen for some reason. I don't know what the problem is. So really, I apologize.
Okay. Then I will ask, I will perhaps switch into English and will ask Professor Jarosław Skira to ask and then Oksana Lemishka to ask their questions in English if possible, so that Jared will understand. Jarosław.
Thank you, Professor Powers, for your presentation. Very illuminating in a number of areas. My question is on the issue of religious nationalism. It's clear that the Ukrainian churches can easily criticize religion being used by Russian Orthodoxy in the war in Donbass, and to criticize that kind of Russian Orthodox nationalism. They have a Russian Orthodox army, for example, and it's also equally difficult in the Ukrainian context for some in the church to be very prophetic and criticize their own Ukrainians, so that they don't engage in kind of that Girardian mimesis where you mimic those who oppress you by inflicting the same kind of injustices upon others. But I can also think of a number of examples where the Ukrainian churches have reached out with the hand of peace to their co-religionists or others, the Russian Orthodox Church from the Ukrainian side. That's kind of a broader context for the question. I was intrigued by that example that you gave by the Irish bishops criticizing the IRA. But in all these activities, it leaves the one who is being prophetic in a very vulnerable position. Would you be able to give a couple of other examples where you've seen that kind of prophetic voice of self kind of criticism, other than the IRA case?
The microphone.
I have now, I enlarged my screen and the interpretation came up. So I now have interpretation of, the screen was not enlarged. And sorry about that. Let me take a hard case. The Catholic Church in Croatia and Bosnia. The Catholic Church in Croatia and Bosnia was severely criticized for being too nationalistic. And as many of you know, Croatia is very much like Poland, where there just is such a close link between the Catholic identity and Croatian identity, and language and culture, everything. It's just a very close link. It's as close as anywhere in the world, at least in the Catholic world. Probably Poland is the only other that might be closer. But But the Croatian bishops were criticized, roundly criticized by other Catholics around the world and just foreign policy experts for promoting nationalism and contributing to the violence. And I think there's some legitimacy to that critique. And I mentioned the two Franciscans who were Mate Boban's advisors. There are other examples of that where there was no distance between religion and extreme nationalists on the Catholic side, the Catholic Croat side. But even Cardinal Kuric, who is seen as an exemplar of sort of the Croatian national identity and Croatian nationalism, he himself said important things, like he publicly said very early in the conflict between Croatia and Serbia, is if a Serb attacks your family, protect that Serb's family. You know, there were a number of times he was very outspoken, saying that we cannot get in, we have to go beyond revenge and beyond narrow understandings of legitimate self-defense, and reach out. I think Bishop Komaritz is another example. I think it was a pragmatic, not a principled endorsement of nonviolence, but he stayed in Banja Luka throughout the conflict. He was under house arrest for some of that time, but he advocated nonviolence. I think for pragmatic reasons, but he advocated nonviolence. He wasn't promoting that kind of extreme nationalism. Cardinal Puljic in Sarajevo, his home was attacked by Croat militants because he was providing refuge for Bosniak Muslims and Croats. His home was filled with refugees, but his home was attacked by Croat militants because they saw him as not sufficiently pro-Croatian nationalism. So even in a hard case like Croatia, I think you find many examples where Catholic leaders stood up to that extreme form of nationalism, that chauvinistic form of nationalism that I'm referring to. And I think in the Yugoslav case, as in the Ukraine case, one sign that it wasn't a chauvinistic form of nationalism was that a main reason that Croatia and Slovenia seceded from Yugoslavia was because they wanted to attach to Western Europe. They wanted to become part of Europe. And so that's different from a closed-in, chauvinistic, exclusivist form of nationalism. To be sure, that all existed within Croatian nationalism, but the church, I think, was very complicated situation for the church, and there's some good positive stories to tell about how leaders in the Catholic Church in Croatia and Bosnia and elsewhere in the former Yugoslavia stood up to the extreme nationalists.
Дуже дякую, Jared. Ласка, Оксана.
Thank you very much, Jared. Now, Oksana Lemishka, the turn is yours. Can I speak in Ukrainian? Yeah, whatever language you prefer.
Okay, good. Then I will try it in English. Thank you very much for the very great intro. I wanted to ask a question, and it is still a little bit vague in my head, but I'll try to explain it as great as possible. In our research, and I'm a sociologist, we have been collecting data from Ukrainians, huge data sets, several thousands yearly. A couple of years ago, we checked if there is a correlation between religion of a person being religious as well. We measured, there was this we measured how religious you are from 0 to 10. So we had an intensity of being religious as well. And we looked if there is a correlation between being religious, practicing a religion, denominations most popular in Ukraine, and let's say political views, support for certain scenarios for the occupied territories, if there is a correlation between being religious and violent tendencies. It is all complicated statistical calculations, and we found none. So we found that there was no correlation in Ukrainian context. A couple of years ago, I assume it might be different a little bit right now when we have the split between Moscow Patriarchy and the other. But there was not a correlation between political opinions or behaviors, civic behaviors, and religion. So I wonder, or being religious, let's put it this way. So I wonder if there have been studies which differentiate the value systems that religion practices or religious people practice and the church as institution, and how it correlates. Whether, for example, if a church becomes active in a conflict, does then people who belong to the church become also active in I hope you understand the question. So the question would be, are there any studies that look and differentiate between church and institution and the value system and how they behave in certain conflicts? I hope it's clear.
The microphone, please, Jared.
That's a very important question, because there's, you know, in everything, there's what we say we believe and what we actually practice. There's always a disconnect between belief and practice, right? That's called original sin. And so not enough is done on lived. I think that you have to look at lived religion. That's where the sociologists of religion are so important, and anthropologists are so important, because you have to look at how religion is actually lived out, and not just what the official teachings are or what the leadership is saying. And that's very hard to get at, because we're very complicated people. We don't just act, especially on political issues, which is what peacebuilding almost always involves, some sort of political issue. There's often a huge gap between religious teaching and our political views, even for people of strong faith. They tend to be more political. Their political identity tends to dominate over their religious identity. So the extent that peacebuilding involves politics, it's not surprising that political identity might be more decisive than our religious identity. I'm familiar with one study that Robert Dowd, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Notre Dame, did some time ago, looking at African conflicts. And he found that in Rwanda, for example, he argued that there actually, while most people in Rwanda called themselves Christian, the level of religious affiliation was rather weak. So they were nominally Christian, but it wasn't very deep, and therefore that limited the ability of religious actors to influence people during the genocide. So that's just one study that I think is looking at similar questions that you looked at in Ukraine. And your study sounds very interesting. I'd love to see it.
Дуже дякую. Так, і це, напевно, питання, з якого...
Thank you very much. This is probably the question from which Gerard started. What is religion? What is it all about? The complexity of defining religion, what religion is about. And now it came to my mind, Genevieve Zubrzicki. It's a lady who is a Polish-Canadian scholar. The Crosses of Auschwitz is her book. And in her book, she shows that religious identity can become a substitute of national identity. Someone can be with no faith. So it's only sociologists who can make research and say that whether the religiousness has something to do with faith.
Mind when you made Pavlo now the last comment that usually I think there's three kinds how to see what religion is, what people tell about themselves when you ask them what they do, like do they go to church, and what they believe, and that must not correlate. I can believe in God and never go to church and so on. Okay, but I want to come to Jared's presentation. Thank you very much. But I wanted to comment or to ask you something in terms of your last but one comment you made about the situation in Croatia. And I think I'm quite familiar with the situations there, and I know these examples. And but my question is it enough when we have, it's good to have them, but is it enough to have these positive examples when we have I would say a majority who have different positions within that church? And you know probably that there have been common statements of the cardinal and the patriarch during the war. It's unique in history. No? We never had it that during a war, the religious leader met in a third country and made appeals to stop the fighting immediately and so on. But it had no impact at all. It didn't stop, it didn't change the war at all. And what is very interesting and very important, I think, is that no one, neither the Catholics nor the Orthodox, made ever use of these statements. No, it was published on the 7th side somewhere in the church newspaper. It was never mentioned again. And so we have it for the records. And we can tell it to the international ecumenical bodies and to the ecumenical community, but at home we keep silent about that. So I understand, and I also agree. It's important nowadays and later and for future generations to have these statements and to have this text. But I fear it's not enough. No? The single statements by I know very well Bishop Komarica and so on. These things are, I like him very much and it's very important, but that's not what. I mean, that's what we need, of course, but that's not all we need. So, and a last short thing, coming back to Oksana's comment, what is very important in my view, when you compare the Yugoslav situation with the Ukrainian, is that you have very clear distinction. The Croats are Catholics, the Serbs are Orthodox, and that's it. And you can be a very good Ukrainian being Orthodox, or being Catholics, or not being religious at all. Majority of Ukrainians are Orthodox, majority of Russians are Orthodox, nevertheless there's a war, and so on. So you cannot use religion in this conflict, in the Ukrainian conflict, in the same way as you could do it in Yugoslavia. No? When you have Croats against Serbs, you automatically have Catholics against Orthodox, and then it is a small step to say it's Catholicism against Orthodoxy.
Right. No. Yeah. I do not have a good understanding of the religious dimensions of the conflict in Ukraine, but I would agree with that assessment from what I know. That I'm not suggesting that Yugoslavia and Ukraine are the same. They're very different, but there are some dynamics that are there. There is a connection between religion and national identity that is at play, and that maybe more on the Russian Orthodox side. I don't know. You'd have to. It's complicated. But I've been involved in endless ecumenical and interreligious initiatives during my career, especially when I was working for the U.S. Catholic bishops. I'm very familiar with an American Catholic bishop was involved in all of those meetings with the religious leaders in the former Yugoslavia. And I agree that, and I've also drafted interreligious statements on Bosnia. I did 5, I think, major interreligious statements of U.S. religious leaders on Bosnia. And it takes an enormous amount of time. And I agree that the impact is often very marginal. And that's why I'm very skeptical of those efforts. I think you need to have those statements on the record. I think it's important to have those there to at least officially to counter the extremist voices, and you can use those interreligious statements to hold religious leaders accountable for what they said. But I'm quite aware that in everywhere I've worked, in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, elsewhere, religious leaders often would say one thing in the United States and a very different thing when they went home. And so I'm very skeptical. I've become very skeptical about those big public interreligious or ecumenical statements. But that's why I emphasize the importance of doing single identity work, working within your own community. That's the real work that needed to be done in Croatia. But unfortunately, the church was just coming out of communism, and so it was weak. I think the depth of affiliation was relatively weak too. So people said they were Catholic, but that didn't mean much. So I think the church was in a weak position in Croatia, and often is in some of these situations. But that's where the work needs to be done. It needs to be, oftentimes it's easier to do the interreligious work sometimes. They get that public statement and say all the right things. The hard work is to work within your own community. And that's a process of formation of the faith and at root. And we often don't do enough within our own community because we do those big public statements, we do the ecumenical things, in part because it's easier to do that, even though it takes a lot of time. It's really hard to form people in your own community in their faith and to counter the people in your own community who are excessively nationalist, who are promoting violence, who are letting their politics take priority over their faith. And so I think the single identity, you can't do effective interreligious or ecumenical work if you haven't done work with your own community first. So I think we agree.
Yes, thank you, Jared. And I think that's a huge challenge to all the ecumenical institutions, yes, how to make the message not an abstract, but somehow realize in practice. Отець Олександр Кушта. Ось, якщо можна камеру включити.
Father Alexander Kushta, if you can, please switch on the camera. I think you also the one who has experience of living in Croatia, and then Stephen will be next. I have a question for Professor Gerard Powers. Can you hear me? Do you hear the interpretation? First of all, I hope that Professor Gerard knows about Srebrenica and the beginning of war in Yugoslavia, the decision that was taken by Mr. Milosevic, the betrayer, who primarily had signed an agreement on the that led to bombarding Zagreb, the Catholic city, and this was called on by the statement of separatists who called for persecution of Serbian community in Zadva. But I think you talk about one side, but you don't talk about the events that took place at the very beginning of the war, and this is the action of proclaiming Serbian kings, and this Chetnik movement against Kustoshevs gave birth to the Yugoslavian war. Mr. Milosevic was calling in Belgrade to occupy all the Orthodox lands up till Hust. I think that Mr. Gerard, I don't know why you have this position, but you somehow avoided the Orthodox side. You omitted talking about what Karadzic did and Vukovar and all, and please explain this situation to me.
You're absolutely right. There was an effort to create a greater Serbia once Yugoslavia dissolved, and that put all the constituent republics in a situation of either seceding I think the secession was basically the secession of Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Kosovo. They were essentially self-defense efforts to deal with this Serbian nationalism, which was trying to either keep a Serb-dominated Yugoslavia together, or when that became impossible, to create a greater Serbia. And so you're absolutely right. That was a driving force behind the conflict. But to my earlier point, it's really important to, the Serbian Orthodox Church, I'm not an expert in the Serbian Orthodox Church, but the Serbian Orthodox Church is has the main possibility and responsibility for dealing with that Serbian nationalism in an appropriate way. What the Catholic Church in Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, elsewhere, they justified their secession. They supported secession based largely on a self-defense argument, and I think it's a legitimate argument. I've written about why I think that claim of secession that was supported by the Pope and the Church was legitimate, mainly as a means of self-defense against this Serbian aggression. But that said, you still have a problem of extreme forms of Croatian nationalism that played a factor in the war. You had Mate Boban in Bosnia, who was not a peace builder but had support of some Catholic leaders. So we have to look at first at our own house and see what we can do to deal with our own house, while we also are, defending our community in legitimate ways against aggression. But I think you have to do both. You can't, and it's hard to do in the middle of a conflict. It's very hard to do. I understand that. It's very hard to, when you are the victim of aggression, to criticize anybody on your own side, because unity is so important when you are facing aggression. Yet I think, the prophetic stance is to find ways to do that and that are constructive. And in the end, if you marginalize the extremist on your own side, you will be stronger in defending against the aggression, I believe.
Дуже дякую. Будь ласка, Стівен Опондо.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. And Professor Gerard has talked much, and I see he has touched more on Africa and Uganda and South Sudan, which are my neighbors here. So I just have an opinion, or maybe just to share some sentiments from him, that even here we realize that when the church is taking a responsibility on issues in peace building, it's somehow like they talk it in boardrooms and they leave it there, but they're not maybe taking action at the grassroots level. So I think there's some linkages of these statements, because of this statement based on what I'm experiencing in the ground. So my other question was, so I just want to know, because you have a vast experience in peace building initiatives, both from the church context and from the bishop context globally. So what are some of the challenges that prospective challenges that we as grassroots peace builders we are likely to face in regards to from the political perspective, also from the social perspective, and also from, I think if I can get those two, it will be enough. Thank you.
My experience is all at the academic and leadership level, so that's limiting for me. I have not done peace building at the grassroots level. I'm familiar with some grassroots peace building initiatives, but I haven't. My work has been mostly with church leadership at the national level or international levels. But one thing I've found, I mentioned this briefly, is that you need, you got the church leaders can't just issue statements. I've written hundreds of statements for church leaders, and they're important, but they're not sufficient. And I know we worked very hard when I was at the U.S. Catholic Bishops to get our statements out into the diocese, into the parishes, and it's very hard to do. But you need that. You need processes of formation that connect what's going on at the national or national level with what's going on at the local level. And oftentimes that's not happening. The national religious leaders at the national level issue their statements, and maybe they advocate at the national level, but they aren't doing much at the local level. And yet there are all kinds of exciting things happening at the local level, the bottom up, and those are critically important. So religious sector institutions need to find ways to make their institution work better, because we're all part of, one church, right? If we're Presbyterian or Orthodox or Catholic, we all say that we're part of one church. We're not just a national church or a local church. We're all the same church. We have to find ways to collaborate across different levels and also across, our boundaries. But it's easier said than done. And here's an example of the disconnect that's often there. I mentioned that in Mindanao, in the southern Philippines and elsewhere, local clergy and lay leaders have sometimes negotiated zones of peace, or they're effectively local ceasefires. And it might take years to develop the credibility and the trust of all the actors, including the armed actors in the region, to get them to agree to a ceasefire, a local ceasefire. And so in Paquit, in the southern Philippines, they achieved that after several years of work. They achieved a local ceasefire. And then one day, the Filipino military bombed the village. And all that work was gone. And it took years to rebuild the trust of all the actors to reinstate the ceasefire. Now the priest and the local imam in that village, they have a relationship with the leadership of the Filipino military. And so the Filipino military will, they now are working at both the local level and the highest level of the Philippine military to make sure nothing like that happens again. But I find that within the church, we're just we don't talk to each other enough. The people at the local level are busy doing their work. The people at the national level are busy doing their work. And I know there's limited time in the day, but we have to find mechanisms and processes to ensure that there's cross-fertilization between what's going on at the local level and what's going on at the national level. That's about institutions properly working.
Це дуже дякую, Джеред. Будь ласка, Діано. І ми, на жаль, більше питань не зможемо взяти. Дякую, прошу. Діано, ви можете задати питання, так?
Thank you. Diana, you can still ask your question, but it will be the last one. Дорогі колеги, дорогі гості,
I want to share my opinion. I have a positive approach to solving problems. Expert diplomacy through the prism of religion can become a tool for Ukrainian foreign policy, a common method of action for the government and civil society in articulating Ukrainian national interests at any level of international relations. The fact that Ukraine is a multi-religious and multicultural state gives us the advantages of cooperating on the path of peace building in Ukraine and with colleagues from the Muslim world, including Turkey, for example, and colleagues from Christian world. In this sense, public diplomacy is the soft power of foreign policy because its effectiveness is achieved through the formation and maintenance of a favorable image of the state and international arena. For example, Islam as a religious identity of our Crimean Tatars may become an additional diplomacy tool on a par with formal diplomacy. Our leaders of religious organizations in Ukraine can involve non-state actors the Muslim world, for example, to the occupied Crimean Peninsula and initiate the creation of negotiation platforms for the peace, for the peaceful settlement of the conflict and for the occupation of our peninsula. Thank you.
Jared, would you like to comment? Or
It just sounds like she's pointing to some positive possibilities for peace building based on the multi-religious and multicultural nature of Ukraine, and that's a really encouraging thing.
Дуже дякую, Діано. Я хочу, щоб ми всі разом подякували професору Джереду Пауерсу, так, за його.
Now, I would like ask you all and myself to express gratitude to the brilliant presentation by Professor Jared Powers, and I also am grateful to you all for your questions and comments.
Okay.
I suggest that we take a 5-minute break, and at 6:20 by Kyiv, meet again in a smaller group, closed group, to give some conclusions and discuss methodological questions or technical questions of techniques. Those who do not have the link for the closed meeting, please write to Irina Kitura. Introduce yourself if we still don't know you. And we will have later 5 more webinars, and we will send you in the nearest future the program of our webinars, the names of our international speakers, and the contexts and the cases they're going to comment. So thank you for attention, and a special gratitude goes to Jared Powers, and see you soon.
Thank you all.